A light snow dusted London streets that fateful December morning in 1847, when Miss Charlotte Armstrong stood at the altar of St. George's Church in Hanover Square. The elegant sanctuary brimmed with the cream of society, whispers and speculations fluttering about like the delicate snowflakes outside. Charlotte's trembling fingers clutched her bouquet of white roses so tightly that the stems threatened to snap under the pressure. Her wedding gown, crafted of the finest ivory silk and adorned with Belgian lace, had cost her father a small fortune, a price willingly paid for the advantageous match with the Duke of Westfield. Yet as the church clock struck 11, then half past, the whispers grew to murmurs. The groom had not arrived. "Perhaps his carriage has been delayed by the weather," her father muttered, tugging at his cravat as beads of sweat formed on his brow despite the December chill. Charlotte maintained her composure, her face a carefully crafted mask that betrayed nothing of the humiliation burning beneath. She had been raised for this moment, to marry well, to secure her family's position, to be the perfect duchess. That was what ladies of quality did. They did not love, they made advantageous matches. When the clock struck noon, the bishop approached with sympathetic eyes. "Miss Armstrong, I fear we must consider." The church doors burst open. Charlotte's heart leapt, but instead of her betrothed, it was his younger brother, Lord Edmund Fairchild, who strode down the aisle. His face was grim as he handed a sealed letter to her father. The contents were brief, delivered in the Duke's elegant hand. "I cannot go through with this arrangement. Forgiveness is not expected." The letter slipped from her father's fingers as gasps rippled through the congregation. Charlotte stood frozen, her mind refusing to comprehend the magnitude of the disgrace befalling her. She had been abandoned at the altar by the Duke of Westfield. "Charlotte," her mother whispered urgently, "we must leave immediately." But Charlotte could not move. Something inside her had fractured in that moment, not her heart, for she had never loved Quentin Fairchild, Duke of Westfield. What broke was her faith in the system she had been raised to navigate, the belief that if she followed every rule of propriety and decorum, her future would be secure. As her father helped her down the altar steps, Charlotte passed the pitying glances of London's elite. In that moment, she made a vow more binding than any marriage could have been. She would never again place her fate in the hands of a man who could discard her so carelessly. Love was a luxury for those who could afford the risk. For Charlotte Armstrong, whose reputation now lay in tatters, such luxuries were forever beyond reach. 3 years passed. The scandal of the Duke's abandonment had faded to occasional whispered reminders when Charlotte entered a room, but never disappeared entirely. She had rebuilt a life of quiet dignity as a companion to elderly Lady Windermere, whose advancing years and poor eyesight required assistance that her own family was too busy to provide. It was not the life Charlotte had been raised to expect, but it afforded her independence of a sort. Lady Windermere was kind, her demands reasonable, and her London townhouse comfortable. More importantly, she rarely entertained, sparing Charlotte the regular pain of society's judgment. "Charlotte, dear, would you read to me from the newspaper?" Lady Windermere asked one spring morning as they took breakfast in the garden room. Charlotte unfolded the Times, scanning for items of interest that wouldn't upset her elderly companion. Her eyes caught on a small notice that made her blood run cold. "What is it, child? You've gone quite pale." "Nothing of consequence," Charlotte lied, quickly turning the page. But the words burned in her mind. "The Duke of Westfield has returned to London after 3 years abroad. His Grace is said to be much changed by his travels." That afternoon, Charlotte ventured out to post Lady Windermere's correspondence. The spring air carried the scent of new beginnings, but for Charlotte, it brought only memories she had labored to bury. As she approached the post office, a familiar carriage bearing the Westfield crest rattled past. Charlotte froze, pressing herself against a shop window, praying she would not be seen. The carriage continued without slowing. Charlotte released her breath, chiding herself for such a dramatic reaction. London was vast. She could easily avoid one man, even a duke, but fate had other plans. As she exited the post office, a deep voice called her name, Miss Armstrong. Charlotte turned slowly, her posture automatically straightening as she faced the man who had altered the course of her life. The Duke of Westfield stood before her, hatless despite convention, revealing hair that was longer than fashion dictated. His face was more weathered than she remembered, tanned by foreign suns, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But it was his expression that struck her most. Gone was the cold hauteur she remembered, replaced by something almost like humility. "Your Grace," she replied with a perfect curtsy, her voice betraying nothing of the turmoil within. What an unexpected surprise! Quentin Fairchild studied her face as though searching for something. "I had not thought to encounter you so soon upon my return. I assure you, had I known of your proximity, I would have taken pains to avoid it," Charlotte replied, her smile polite but eyes glacial. "If you'll excuse me, Lady Windermere awaits my return." "Lady Windermere, you are her companion now." The unspoken reminder of her reduced circumstances hung between them. Yes. Not all of us had the luxury of fleeing abroad when life became uncomfortable. A flash of pain crossed his features. "Charlotte, Miss Armstrong, might I have a moment of your time? There are matters I wish to address." "I believe you forfeited any claim to my time 3 years ago, Your Grace." Charlotte inclined her head slightly. "Good day." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her pace measured. Only when she was certain she had turned the corner did she press a hand to her wildly beating heart. She had faced him and emerged intact. The encounter had lasted but a minute, yet it felt like surviving a tempest. That evening, as Charlotte helped Lady Windermere prepare for bed, a delivery arrived, a small parcel addressed to Miss Charlotte Armstrong. Inside lay a leather-bound journal with no accompanying note. Curiosity overcoming caution, she opened it after retiring to her own modest chamber. The first page bore a single line in a familiar hand, "The true account of why I could not marry and what I have learned since." Charlotte nearly threw it into the fire. How dare he attempt to explain away his cruelty after 3 years of silence? But something, perhaps the same stubborn pride that had carried her through her disgrace, made her turn the page. What she read that night changed everything she thought she knew about Quentin Fairchild and the day he had abandoned her. The Duke's journal revealed a truth Charlotte had never suspected. He had not fled from marriage out of callousness or because he had found her wanting. He had discovered, mere hours before the ceremony, that his estate was not merely in difficulty as he had believed, but completely ruined by his father's gambling debts and poor investments. The creditors had been moments from seizing everything. "To have married you," he wrote, "would have drawn you into immediate ruin. Your father would have lost the substantial dowry he had transferred to my solicitors the day prior. I could not bear to see you reduced to poverty because of my family's disgrace. I made the only choice I could. I fled with what little remained, determined to rebuild what was lost before I could face England again. It was cowardly, perhaps, but I convinced myself it was honorable." The journal detailed his journey first to America, then to India, where through a combination of business acumen he hadn't known he possessed and sheer desperate determination, he had gradually restored his fortune. Each entry contained not only his business dealings, but reflections on what he had left behind, on Charlotte herself, whose face, he wrote, had haunted him across continents. Charlotte closed the journal near dawn, her mind reeling. If his account were true, and the detailed descriptions of business transactions and foreign places suggested authenticity, then his abandonment had been an act of misguided protection rather than rejection. Yet it changed nothing about the public humiliation she had endured, the whispers that followed her still, the future that had been altered irrevocably. She placed the journal in her dresser drawer, determined to return it unacknowledged. She owed Quentin Fairchild nothing, not forgiveness, not understanding, and certainly not the piece of her heart that treacherously stirred at his words. 2 days later, Charlotte accompanied Lady Windermere to the British Museum, one of the elderly woman's favourite diversions. As they examined a display of Egyptian artifacts, a familiar voice spoke behind them. "Lady Windermere, what a pleasure to see you engaging with our national treasures." Charlotte stiffened as the Duke of Westfield bowed over Lady Windermere's hand. "Your Grace," Lady Windermere exclaimed, clearly delighted by the attention. "How wonderful to see you. Have you met my dear companion, Miss Armstrong?" "We are acquainted," Charlotte said tersely. "Indeed," the Duke replied, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. "Though I fear our acquaintance was interrupted prematurely." Lady Windermere glanced between them with sudden interest. "Well, this is most fortuitous. Your Grace, perhaps you might escort us through the Roman exhibition. My eyes are not what they once were, and Charlotte knows so little of classical antiquities." Before Charlotte could protest, the arrangement was made. She found herself walking beside the Duke, while Lady Windermere followed with her maid, maintaining a distance that made private conversation possible. "You read my journal," he said quietly as they paused before a marble bust. "I glanced at it," Charlotte conceded, keeping her gaze fixed on the sculpture. And it changes nothing, Your Grace. Whatever your reasons, the result remains the same. I am forever marked by what happened that day." The Duke's voice dropped lower. "Do you imagine I am not similarly marked? That I have not carried the weight of my decision every day since?" Charlotte finally turned to face him, her voice barely above a whisper but edged with steel. "You had a choice, sir. You chose to leave without a word of explanation. A note, a private conversation, anything would have been better than public abandonment. You protected yourself and your pride while sacrificing mine. I protected your father's fortune. I protected you from becoming a duchess without a duchy," he countered, though the confidence in his tone faltered. "You denied me the dignity of choice," Charlotte replied. "And that I cannot forgive." Their conversation was interrupted as Lady Windermere approached, commenting on the beauty of the exhibitions. The remainder of the visit passed in strained politeness, the air between Charlotte and the Duke charged with unspoken recriminations and regrets. As they parted outside the museum, the Duke handed Charlotte into Lady Windermere's carriage with perfect courtesy. Just as she settled, he pressed a folded note into her gloved palm. "I have reacquired my grandmother's townhouse on Berkeley Square," he said formally. "Lady Windermere, I would be honoured if you and Miss Armstrong would attend a small gathering there next Thursday evening." Lady Windermere, oblivious to the tension, accepted with pleasure. Later, alone in her room, Charlotte unfolded his note. "I respect your anger, but if I learned anything in my time away, it is that regret is a poison that only truth can cure. I ask only for the chance to make amends. Not for forgiveness, which I do not deserve, but for understanding." Charlotte crushed the note in her fist, then carefully smoothed it out again, folding it beside his journal in her drawer. She told herself she would attend the gathering only because Lady Windermere wished it, and refusing would require explanations she could not give. The truth, that some traitorously curious part of her wanted to understand the man who had both ruined and apparently tried to save her, was something she could scarcely admit even to herself. The Duke's townhouse on Berkeley Square hummed with quiet conversation as footmen circulated with champagne and delicate canapés. The gathering was small by ton standards, perhaps 30 people, but included several influential peers and their wives. Charlotte remained close to Lady Windermere, providing a steady arm and murmured identifications of approaching guests. "Miss Armstrong," came the Duke's voice as he approached them, looking resplendent in formal evening attire. "Lady Windermere, I'm so pleased you could attend." "A lovely gathering, Your Grace," Lady Windermere replied, "though I confess surprise at its intimate nature. I had expected something more grandiose to mark your return to society." "I find I no longer have taste for excessive display," he answered. 3 years of simpler living teaches one to value substance over spectacle. His eyes met Charlotte's as he spoke, and she felt the weight of his meaning. This was no coincidence. He had arranged this gathering specifically to ease her return to society under his protection, minimizing the opportunity for gossip by controlling who was invited. "Would you do me the honor of showing Lady Windermere my collection of Oriental porcelain?" he asked Charlotte. "I acquired several pieces in Canton that might interest her. My housekeeper can guide you to the Blue Salon." It was a transparent attempt to separate them from Lady Windermere, but the elderly woman nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, do go, Charlotte. I shall be perfectly comfortable here with Mrs. Harrington." She indicated an elderly widow nearby, clearly part of the Duke's orchestration. Reluctantly, Charlotte allowed herself to be guided through the house to a small salon decorated with Eastern influences. Display cabinets held delicate porcelain pieces, but she barely glanced at them as the Duke closed the door behind them, leaving it properly ajar but affording them privacy. "This is most improper," Charlotte said stiffly. "Propriety," he replied, "is something I've come to question after seeing how differently the world operates beyond our shores." He gestured to the room around them. "In China, I learned that their finest porcelain is often made stronger by being broken and repaired with gold. The Japanese call it kintsugi. They believe the piece becomes more beautiful for having been broken, its history visible rather than hidden." Charlotte folded her arms. "I did not come for philosophical lessons, Your Grace." "Quentin," he said quietly, "after everything, at least grant me the use of my name in private." "After everything," Charlotte echoed. "I believe formality is the only safe harbor between us." He moved to a desk and withdrew a document, offering it to her. "Perhaps this will convince you of my sincerity." Charlotte accepted it cautiously. It was a legal document transferring a substantial sum to her name, along with the deed to a modest but respectable property in Bath. "What is this?" she demanded. "Security," he answered simply. "Independence. Whatever you wish to call it." She thrust the papers back at him. "I am not for sale, Your Grace, if this is your attempt to purchase forgiveness." "It is not," he interrupted, refusing to take the documents. "It is restitution. Had we married, you would have had the protection of my name and fortune. I denied you that. This ensures that whatever happens between us now, you will never be dependent on another's charity again." Charlotte's hands trembled. "You think my affections can be bought with financial security?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you cannot truly choose to forgive or not forgive when your circumstances leave you vulnerable. This removes that obstacle. Accept it as you would a settlement after a breach of promise suit, which you had every right to pursue, but did not." His logic was sound, yet the gesture felt both liberating and insulting simultaneously. It acknowledged the wrong done to her while attempting to pay for it in coin. "And if I accept," she said slowly, "what then? What do you expect?" "Only the opportunity to be known," he answered. "Not as the man who abandoned you, nor as the Duke of Westfield, but simply as Quentin. A man who made a grievous error in judgment and has spent 3 years trying to become worthy of a second chance he knows he doesn't deserve." Charlotte looked down at the papers, then back at his face, so changed from the proud, distant man she had almost married. In his eyes, she saw something she had never witnessed before their broken engagement: vulnerability. "I will consider it," she finally said, carefully folding the documents into her reticule. "But I make no promises beyond that." "I would expect nothing more," he replied, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "Now shall we examine the porcelain before Lady Windermere wonders what has become of us?" As they moved around the displays, their conversation remained safely focused on the delicate objects before them. Yet Charlotte found herself studying Quentin Fairchild with new eyes, wondering what other changes lay beneath the surface of the man who had once broken her trust so completely. The weeks following the Duke's gathering brought unexpected developments in Charlotte's carefully ordered existence. Lady Windermere, having thoroughly enjoyed her evening, began accepting more invitations, always ensuring that the Duke of Westfield would be present. Charlotte suspected collusion between them, but could hardly refuse to accompany her elderly employer. Spring blossomed into early summer, and Charlotte found herself reluctantly drawn into a careful dance of proximity with the Duke. At Lady Harrington's musical evening, they discussed his travels in India. During a stroll through Hyde Park, he described the rugged terrain of the American frontier. At the Countess of Pembroke's dinner, they debated the merits of various translations of Homer. Through these conversations, Charlotte gradually pieced together the journey that had transformed Quentin Fairchild from the privileged aristocrat who had known nothing beyond his birthright to a man who had labored alongside merchants, learned to navigate foreign customs, and developed a perspective that transcended the narrow confines of English society. "You still have not told me why you left me that journal," Charlotte said one afternoon as they walked behind Lady Windermere in Kew Gardens. A letter would have sufficed for explanation. Quentin considered this before answering. "A letter can be crafted to persuade. The journal was written with no audience in mind. It contains my unfiltered thoughts, my failures as well as successes. I wanted you to know me as I am, not as I might present myself to win your favor." His honesty disarmed her. It had become increasingly difficult to maintain the wall of resentment she had built around her heart, especially as she came to understand the magnitude of what he had accomplished in rebuilding his fortune from nothing. "The property in Bath," she said carefully. "I have had my solicitor examine the documents. Everything appears in order." "And will you accept it?" Charlotte hesitated. "I have decided to establish it as a trust. The house shall become a residence for gentlewomen who find themselves in reduced circumstances through no fault of their own." Quentin stopped walking, genuine surprise and admiration crossing his features. "That is remarkably generous." "I know what it is to fall from grace," she replied simply, "and unlike yourself, not everyone possesses the means to rebuild." "You continue to surprise me, Charlotte Armstrong." "Perhaps you never truly knew me to begin with," she countered, but without the bitterness that would have colored such words mere weeks ago. That evening, as Charlotte helped Lady Windermere prepare for bed, the elderly woman fixed her with an unusually penetrating gaze. "My dear, I hope you will forgive an old woman's impertinence, but I cannot help observing the way the Duke looks at you when he believes himself unobserved." Charlotte's hands stilled as she arranged Lady Windermere's nightcap. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I may be old, but I am not blind, child. There is history between you. That much has been obvious since our encounter at the museum. He watches you as a man might watch a treasure he once possessed and lost through carelessness." Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It is complicated, my lady." "Life generally is," Lady Windermere replied with a soft chuckle. "But I would remind you that at my age, one gains perspective on what truly matters. Pride and resentment make poor companions in one's twilight years. Take it from someone who knows." After completing her duties, Charlotte returned to her room and withdrew the Duke's journal from its hiding place. She had read it several times now, each reading revealing new layers of the man Quentin Fairchild had become. One passage particularly haunted her. "I dream of her still, standing before the altar, trusting in promises I was about to break. In those dreams, I make a different choice. I tell her the truth. I give her the chance to decide whether a penniless duke is worth the sacrifice of her position and comfort. But then I wake to the reality of my cowardice, and I know that some choices, once made, can never be unmade." Charlotte closed the journal, her heart conflicted. For 3 years, she had nursed her wounded pride, building a life from the ashes of her ruined prospects. She had convinced herself that love was a luxury she could not afford, that trust, once broken, could never be restored. Yet in Quentin's persistence, In his willingness to lay bare his flaws and regrets, she glimpsed something she had never expected to find. The possibility that her greatest wound might become, like the Japanese pottery he had described, stronger and more valuable for having been broken. Midsummer brought Lady Windermere's annual journey to Bath to take the waters for her health. Charlotte, expecting to accompany her employer as usual, was surprised when Lady Windermere announced a change of plans over breakfast. "I've decided to ask my niece to accompany me this year," she declared. "You, my dear, have been offered a position as temporary curator for the Hartley collection at the British Museum. The Duke of Westfield recommended you most highly, and I have endorsed the appointment." Charlotte nearly dropped her teacup. "I beg your pardon." Lady Windermere smiled benignly. "The late Mr. Hartley's collection of illuminated manuscripts requires cataloguing before being formally donated to the museum. The Duke mentioned your excellent knowledge of medieval literature. Apparently, you discussed Chaucer quite extensively at the Pembroke dinner, and suggested you would be ideal for the task. It would be for 6 weeks, with compensation commensurate to your position here, which will remain open for your return." Charlotte sat speechless. The position sounded fascinating, perfectly aligned with her interests she had mentioned only in passing to Quentin during their conversations. That he had listened, remembered, and acted to create this opportunity for her was astounding. "This is his doing entirely, isn't it?" she finally asked. Lady Windermere's eyes twinkled. "The Duke may have identified the opportunity, but the appointment rests entirely on your qualifications, my dear. The museum's board reviewed your education and background quite thoroughly." That afternoon, Charlotte found herself walking to Berkeley Square, her emotions a tangle of gratitude and confusion. The Duke's butler showed her into the library, where Quentin stood examining a map spread across his desk. He looked up in surprise as she was announced. "Charlotte," he said, hastily rolling the map. "This is unexpected." "As was my morning conversation with Lady Windermere," she replied. "I understand I have you to thank for an appointment at the British Museum." He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I merely mentioned your qualifications when I heard of the need. The decision was made on merit." "Why," she asked directly, "why go to such trouble?" Quentin gestured for her to sit, taking the chair opposite. "Because in our conversations, I've seen how your mind comes alive when discussing literature and history. Because your position with Lady Windermere, while respectable, hardly challenges your considerable intelligence. And you took it upon yourself to rectify that." "I took it upon myself to create an opportunity," he corrected gently. "Whether you seized it was entirely your choice." Charlotte studied him, trying to reconcile this thoughtful man with the one who had once abandoned her without explanation. "You've changed," she said finally. "Necessity is an effective teacher," he replied. "When one loses everything, wealth, position, even self-respect, one must either transform or perish." "And what lesson did you learn most thoroughly?" Quentin's gaze held hers steadily. "That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in its presence. 3 years ago, I fled rather than face my failures. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but in truth, I was protecting myself from seeing disappointment in your eyes." His honesty disarmed her. "And now? Now I understand that true protection means offering truth, however painful, and allowing others the dignity of their own choices." He leaned forward slightly. "I cannot undo the harm I caused you, Charlotte. But I can ensure that your future holds more possibilities than your past." The appointment, she realized, wasn't an attempt to buy her forgiveness. It was his way of restoring something he had taken from her: opportunity, independence, the chance to be valued for her mind rather than merely as someone's wife or companion. "I've accepted the position," she said, "though I suspect Lady Windermere had already assured the museum of my acceptance before informing me." Quentin smiled. She can be quite determined when she believes herself right. A trait you apparently share. Charlotte rose to leave, but paused. Thank you, not for the position itself, but for seeing me, truly seeing me, in a way few have bothered to do. As she departed, Charlotte felt something shift within her, a loosening of the tight knot of resentment she had carried for so long. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite yet, but perhaps it was the beginning of understanding. The work at the British Museum absorbed Charlotte completely. The Hartley collection comprised over 200 medieval manuscripts, each requiring careful examination, description, and cataloguing. She lost herself in the beautiful illuminations, the painstaking calligraphy, the stories preserved through centuries by dedicated hands. Quentin visited the museum frequently, sometimes bringing rare texts from his own library that complemented the collection. Their conversations, once constrained by caution, flowed more freely among the ancient manuscripts. He respected her expertise, challenged her interpretations, and gradually they developed a rapport that transcended their complicated past. "This reminds me of a manuscript I saw in Florence," he remarked one afternoon, examining a particularly fine book of hours. "The use of lapis lazuli for the blue pigment suggests a wealthy patron." Charlotte nodded. The gold leaf alone would have cost a fortune. Faith expressed through conspicuous wealth, a contradiction that seems particularly medieval. "Is it so different now?" Quentin asked. "We build grand cathedrals and endow charities, not merely for God's glory, but for our own reputations." "Speaking from experience, Your Grace?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. He laughed, a sound she had come to treasure for its rarity and genuineness. "Guilty, I suppose, though I prefer to think my recent donations to the orphanage on Fleet Street stem from conviction rather than vanity." The orphanage. This was news to Charlotte. Quentin looked slightly embarrassed. "My mother was raised there before being adopted by a childless couple. It's a connection I only discovered after her death, going through her personal papers." She never spoke of it. Charlotte was touched by this revelation, another piece of the puzzle that was Quentin Fairchild sliding into place. "You continue to surprise me." "As do you," he replied, his eyes warm. "I never expected the formidable Miss Armstrong to have such passionate opinions on 12th century marginalia." Their laughter drew the attention of the museum's director, who smiled approvingly. The Duke's patronage of the museum was valuable. His evident interest in their newest temporary curator had not gone unnoticed. As the weeks passed, Charlotte found her work at the museum increasingly fulfilling. Lady Windermere, upon returning from Bath, readily agreed that Charlotte should complete the cataloguing project, even if it meant reduced hours as her companion. The arrangement gave Charlotte unprecedented independence and intellectual satisfaction. One rainy afternoon in late August, Charlotte was working alone in the manuscript room when Quentin arrived unexpectedly, his greatcoat dripping from the downpour. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, removing his hat. "I've received news that may interest you regarding the provenance of the Hartley Psalter." But as he approached her workstation, he stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of the table. Charlotte rose in alarm. "Are you unwell?" "A momentary dizziness," he assured her, but his complexion had gone alarmingly pale. "You should sit," she insisted, guiding him to a chair. "You're burning with fever." Her hand had brushed his as she steadied him, feeling the unnatural heat of his skin. Quentin attempted to rise. "I should return home. My apologies for disturbing your work." "Don't be absurd," Charlotte said firmly. "You're in no condition to travel. Wait here while I send for your carriage and a physician." Despite his protests, she dispatched a museum attendant with urgent messages. By the time the Duke's carriage arrived, Quentin could barely stand. The fever had risen rapidly, his eyes becoming glassy and unfocused. "I must see him safely home," Charlotte told the museum director, who nodded his understanding. The journey to Berkeley Square seemed interminable as Quentin drifted in and out of lucidity, occasionally murmuring in what sounded like Hindi. a remnant of his time in India. By the time they arrived, he needed his valet and footman to help him to his bedchamber. The physician arrived promptly, his examination thorough, but his expression grave as he rejoined Charlotte in the drawing room. "It appears His Grace has contracted a tropical fever," he explained. "Possibly recurrent malaria from his time abroad. The next 48 hours will be critical." "What treatment do you recommend?" Charlotte asked, her heart constricting with fear she hadn't expected to feel. "Quinine, cool compresses, and careful nursing," the physician replied. "I've left instructions with his valet, but given the severity, constant attendance would be advisable." Charlotte knew what propriety demanded, that she returned to Lady Windermere's home, perhaps sending inquiries about the Duke's health over the coming days. But as she recalled Quentin's feverish state, how vulnerable he had appeared, she found herself unable to abandon him. "I shall stay," she said decisively. "Please send word to Lady Windermere explaining the circumstances." The physician raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "I'll have the housekeeper prepare a room for you, Miss Armstrong, and perhaps engage a professional nurse to assist." But when Charlotte entered Quentin's sick room, she dismissed the valet who had been awkwardly attempting to apply a cool compress. "I have some experience with nursing," she told him. "Please ensure fresh water and clean linens are available." Alone with Quentin, Charlotte placed a gentle hand on his burning forehead. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with effort. "Charlotte," he whispered, "you shouldn't be here, not proper." "Hush," she replied, wringing out a fresh compress. "Propriety seems a poor excuse to abandon someone in need." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before he lapsed back into restless unconsciousness. Through the night, Charlotte maintained her vigil, replacing compresses, administering the quinine tincture, and sponging his fevered limbs with cool water. When he thrashed in delirium, she spoke soothingly, her voice seeming to calm him. When he murmured her name, asking forgiveness for sins both real and imagined, she held his hand and assured him all was well. By dawn, Charlotte was exhausted, but Quentin's fever showed no signs of breaking. The physician returned, his expression grim as he examined his patient. "The fever fights hard," he said. "Continue as you have been. I can offer little more in the way of treatment." Lady Windermere arrived mid-morning, concern evident on her weathered face. "My dear girl, you must rest," she insisted, finding Charlotte still at Quentin's bedside. "The nurse can watch him while you sleep." But Charlotte shook her head. "He seems calmer when I'm present. I'll rest when his fever breaks." Lady Windermere studied her face carefully. "You care for him?" It wasn't a question, and Charlotte didn't treat it as one. "I understand him now in ways I couldn't before. Whatever happens, I need to be here." The elderly woman nodded. "Then I shall arrange to stay as well, to preserve the proprieties, though I suspect gossip is the least of our concerns at present." Through a second day and night, Quentin's condition remained critical. Charlotte dozed in brief intervals, but never left the sick room for long. She read to him from his journal when they were alone, returning his words to him as though they might anchor him to the world of the living. Near midnight on the second night, as Charlotte bathed his face with lavender water, Quentin suddenly grasped her wrist with surprising strength. "Charlotte," he said, his voice hoarse but clearer than it had been. "Are you real, or am I dreaming still?" She laid her palm against his cheek. "I'm here. Your fever is breaking, I think." His eyes, though tired, were lucid. "You stayed. Why?" Charlotte considered the question carefully. The answer that came to her lips surprised her with its simple truth. "Because despite everything, the thought of a world without you in it has become unbearable to me." Quentin's fingers weakly tightened around hers. "I don't deserve your care." "Perhaps not," she agreed softly. "But you have it nonetheless." He drifted back to sleep, but his rest was peaceful now, his breathing even. Charlotte, allowing herself to acknowledge the depth of her feelings at last, bent and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead before finally surrendering to her own exhaustion in the chair beside his bed. When she woke, sunlight streamed through the partially opened curtains, and Quentin was watching her, propped against his pillows, pale but unmistakably improved. "Good morning," he said, his voice weak but warm. "I believe I owe you my life." Charlotte straightened, suddenly aware of her rumpled appearance and the impropriety of having slept in his bedchamber, chaperone in the house or not. "You owe me nothing. The physician did the real work." "He tells a different story," Quentin replied. "He says your constant care made the difference." Charlotte rose, smoothing her skirts. "Well, you are clearly much improved, so I shall leave you to rest properly. Lady Windermere is here. I should attend to her." As she turned to go, Quentin called after her. "Charlotte," she paused at the door, "thank you for not abandoning me when you had every right to do so." The parallel to their past hung between them, acknowledged but not belabored. Charlotte merely nodded before slipping from the room, her heart both lighter and heavier than before. Quentin's recovery proceeded slowly but steadily. Charlotte returned to her work at the museum, but visited Berkeley Square each evening with Lady Windermere to check on his progress. As his strength returned, they often spent hours in conversation, sometimes with Lady Windermere present, occasionally alone when the elderly woman dozed in her chair. "You're not returning to Lady Windermere's employ when the museum project concludes, are you?" Quentin asked one evening as they sat in his library, the first time he had been strong enough to come downstairs. Charlotte looked up from the book she had been reading aloud. "I haven't decided. The museum has hinted they might have additional work, though not a permanent position." "I have a proposition," Quentin said carefully. "My library requires proper cataloguing, and I've acquired several collections of manuscripts during my travels that would benefit from scholarly attention. Would you consider undertaking the project?" Charlotte closed the book. "Are you offering me employment, Your Grace?" "I'm offering you purpose," he corrected. "With compensation, naturally, and complete scholarly freedom. The work could take a year or more, given the extent of the collections." Charlotte studied his face, seeking ulterior motives, but finding only sincerity. "Why?" "Because you're the most qualified person I know for the task," he answered. "And selfishly, because I've grown accustomed to our conversations. The thought of their cessation is uncomfortable." It was the closest he had come to expressing personal feelings since his illness. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm. People would talk. "People always talk," Quentin replied with a faint smile. "But if it concerns you, we could establish formal terms through my solicitor, and you could reside here with a proper companion, Lady Windermere, perhaps, or another suitable chaperone." The arrangement was tempting, intellectually stimulating work, independence, and continued proximity to the man who had somehow, against all odds, rebuilt the bridge of trust between them. Yet Charlotte hesitated. "May I consider it?" "Of course," he said, though disappointment flickered briefly in his eyes. "Take whatever time you need." The following week, as Charlotte completed her final day at the museum, she found Quentin waiting for her outside. He looked fully recovered now, elegant in a charcoal frock coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "I thought you might allow me to escort you home," he said. "It's a fine evening for a walk." Charlotte accepted his arm, conscious of curious glances from her colleagues. They strolled in comfortable silence until reaching the park, where the privacy of tree-lined paths allowed for more intimate conversation. "I've been thinking about your offer," Charlotte began. "And I've been reconsidering it," Quentin interrupted gently. "It was unfair of me to suggest an arrangement that places you in an ambiguous position, neither truly independent nor—" He hesitated. "Nor what?" Charlotte prompted. Quentin stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Charlotte, I need to speak plainly. These past months have shown me that what I felt for you 3 years ago was a pale shadow of what I feel now. Then I admired you as one might admire a suitable match, with propriety and distance. Now I know you, your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for forgiveness, and I find myself hopelessly in love with the woman you truly are." Charlotte's breath caught. "Quentin, please let me finish," he said quickly. "I have no right to expect your affection after what happened between us, but I cannot in good conscience offer you employment when what I truly wish to offer is my heart, my name, and everything I possess." He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. "I am not the man who left you at the altar. That man was a coward who thought wealth and title were all he had to offer. I stand before you now with those things restored, yes, but also with hard-won wisdom and the humility to know that you may reject me again, and that if you do, I will have earned that rejection through my past actions." Charlotte felt tears threatening. "You're proposing." "I'm asking if you might consider allowing me to court you properly," he clarified, "with the understanding that my intentions are honorable and my heart entirely yours, whether or not you ever choose to accept it." Charlotte looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, so dear to her now, so different from the proud, distant man she had once agreed to marry out of duty rather than affection. "These past months," she said slowly, "I've come to know you in ways I never did before. The man who abandoned me was a stranger. The man before me now is someone I respect, admire, and," she drew a steadying breath, "and love, despite my best efforts to guard my heart against precisely that outcome." Hope blazed in Quentin's eyes. "Charlotte, are you saying—" "I'm saying," she interrupted with newfound confidence, "that I don't need to be courted. I know my own mind and heart. If you are proposing marriage, then my answer is yes." For a moment, Quentin seemed stunned. Then his face transformed with a joy so pure it took Charlotte's breath away. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I don't want gratitude or obligation. I want only genuine affection freely given." Charlotte laughed softly. "Quentin Fairchild, when have you ever known me to say something I don't mean? I love you, not for your title or your fortune, but for the man you've become. The man who sees me clearly and values what he sees." Propriety forgotten, Quentin drew her into his arms there in the secluded path, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of years of longing finally fulfilled. Charlotte responded with equal fervor, her arms twining around his neck as she surrendered to the joy of being truly, completely known and loved. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quentin pressed his forehead to hers. "I promise you, Charlotte Armstrong, that I will spend every day of our lives ensuring you never regret this decision." "And I promise you," she replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness, "that the past is truly behind us. What matters is the future we'll build together." 2 months later, Charlotte Armstrong once again stood before the altar at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, wearing a gown of silver blue silk that complemented her eyes rather than the traditional white. This time there was no fearful anticipation, no sense of duty or obligation, only the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, marrying not a title, but a man she had come to love with her whole heart. And when Quentin Fairchild, Duke of Westfield, appeared precisely on time, his eyes never leaving hers as he strode confidently down the aisle, Charlotte knew that what had once been her greatest humiliation had become, through time and transformation, her greatest blessing. They exchanged vows with clear voices and unwavering gazes, their words not merely ritual, but promises tempered by experience and cemented by choice. As the bishop pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin squeezed Charlotte's hand. "No running away this time," he whispered. "No need," she answered, her smile radiant. "This time, we're exactly where we're meant to be." And as they turned to face their assembled guests, the newly wedded Duke and Duchess of Westfield stepped forward together into a future built not on the shifting sands of duty and expectation, but on the solid foundation of love that had been tested, broken, and ultimately made stronger by the golden threads of forgiveness.